the president said what he's now said publicly, which is if the deal isn't accepted by Hamas, then there's no restraint. And we know what no restraint means. We've seen it.
Now, Israel and Hamas have begun indirect peace talks in Egypt as the US steps up the pressure on both sides to reach agreement on President Trump's plan to end the war in Gaza. Over the weekend, Donald Trump said he's asking those involved to move fast to accept his proposals, which would mean the release of the remaining hostages, the eventual withdrawal of Israeli troops, and no role for Hamas in the future administration of Gaza. Negotiations are expected to continue tomorrow, which marks 2 years since the October the 7th attacks in which 1,200 people were killed. Earlier this evening, President Trump spoke at the Oval Office.
We have a really good chance of making a deal, and it'll be a lasting deal. We want to have peace. This is beyond Gaza. Gaza is a big deal, but this is really peace in the Middle East. And the amazing thing is we have every Arab country, every Muslim country, we have every country surrounding. They all want. I spoke with President Erdogan of Turkey. He's fantastic. He's been pushing very hard. He's a very powerful guy, and he's been pushing very, very hard to get this deal done. And Hamas has a lot of respect for him. They have a lot of respect for Qatar. They have a lot of respect for UAE and Saudi Arabia. We have everybody is on our side to get this deal done.
Well, let's talk to David Hale, who's a former Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs. He's also a former US Special Envoy for Middle East Peace and was ambassador to both Lebanon and Jordan. Great to speak to you, David. Good evening.
Thank you, Carol. Glad to be here.
Well, we heard the president there sounding optimistic, as he quite often would be, about proposals which he came up with himself in conjunction with others. Do you think he's right to sound so optimistic at this stage?
Well, my career taught me that anyone who's optimistic about Middle East peace may need a head examination. But at this juncture, I do think that President Trump and his team has come up with, for the first time since this terrible war erupted, with a plan that has a chance of success. It's a realistic approach that credibly addresses the day-to-day problems needed for the day after a ceasefire in Gaza. And so I'm optimistic about that myself. The problem is we still are where we always have been at ground, step one, which is how do you get a ceasefire, prisoner exchange, and hostage exchange, and a demilitarization of of Hamas. And that challenge that problem has been one that no one has solved up till now. We'll see if the pressure mounting on Hamas this week succeeds.
Well, I mean, beyond those comments from the US president, we've heard very little from those indirect talks in Egypt. But to get to this stage, Hamas did agree to some of the proposals, critically the release of the hostages. But there's quite a lot that they haven't agreed to, isn't there?
Right. If you look at the fine print of the statements that they have made, they've agreed to an exchange, which they, of course, agreed to before, but not been able to do. But when you look at the actual chief features of the 20-point plan, the governance of Gaza, the security of Gaza, and the economic development of Gaza, their fine print would basically challenges the president's proposal. And of course, the basic problem is that Hamas's leverage consists of these hostages. So they're going to try to seek as strong a commitment as possible on the day after proposals before they actually give up their hostages. So that's the challenge, I think, of this week.
And we've heard the US president, or we saw his posts on social media, saying that he wants things to move really fast. He wants to see clearly the release of the hostages as a first hugely important symbolic step. But as you say, once Hamas has given up the remaining hostages, it's thought there may be 20 still alive. All that's then left are then demands for it to disarm and to have no future role in the governance of Gaza. It would amount to Hamas accepting defeat, wouldn't it?
Yes, but I think the pressure on Hamas is as intense, in fact, more intense than it's ever been. President Erdogan, as Trump mentioned, the Arab states that are more or less, sympathetic with Hamas have been putting pressure on them. the reality on the ground and the fate of the Palestinians. The desperate situation creates pressure. But there's tension, if not even disagreement, between the more realistic elements, the political leadership in Qatar of Hamas, and the military men on the ground in Gaza. And in fact, I doubt that there's much command and control anymore over many of these bands of armed men who are lightly affiliated with Hamas, but basically are in a state of desperation. How will we bring them to heel if there is an agreement? That's going to be a key challenge.
And Benjamin Netanyahu has given his support to the plan, verbally at least, in public. But we're reading in the Times tonight that the Israelis are still stepping up their plans to press on with their offensive into Gaza if this deal does fall through, or if it fails to reach an agreement, that they would be prepared, if anything, to go even further in terms of trying to take out the leaders of Hamas and seize those parts of Gaza that they don't control already.
Right. I mean, this is to be expected, whether you like it or not. The Israelis are going to complete the job if diplomacy doesn't accomplish it. I think President Trump, who actually cares about the fate of the hostages and the fate of the Palestinians living in Gaza, is doing his utmost to try to prevent that from happening. But he's himself made clear that if Hamas doesn't accept this deal, then the situation is going to be very grave for them. The deal actually, it does mean that Hamas is not going to be governing Gaza, but that was a completely unrealistic expectation anyway at this stage. So it does offer an avenue for those leaders of Hamas who are remaining in Gaza to actually save their own skins and get out.
Yeah, and President Trump issued that warning, didn't he, saying that if Hamas does not go ahead and release the hostages, they'll be annihilated. I mean, that does appear to indicate that if this deal does fall through, and as you say, so much could still go wrong, that he would essentially give the green light to the Israelis to go ahead and do whatever they want.
Yes, I think he's essentially done that, both in private with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Oval Office when he kind of twisted the arms, somewhat to get this deal agreed to by the Israelis, because the conservative wing, the right wing of the cabinet doesn't really agree with it. But I think the trade-off was probably that the president said what he's now said publicly, which is if the deal isn't accepted by Hamas, then there's no restraint. And we know what no restraint means. We've seen it.
And is there a possibility that we could see, as we have in the past, a ceasefire and the release of hostages, perhaps some of the hostages, but then the efforts to get to a second stage, which does look at some form of long-term stable future for Gaza, that at that stage it all falls apart?
It's possible, for sure. In fact, you can always put money on things falling apart in the Middle East. But I do think that if Hamas does concede a ceasefire, that means they're prepared to concede much more as well, because the ceasefire is the main, the hostages are their main leverage, as we said earlier. So I do think then with adroit diplomacy, maximum pressure tactics, a strong and determined president, full U.S. backing for this proposal, those patrons of Hamas like Turkey and Qatar fully engaged, we've got a chance at something that could actually stabilize the situation in Gaza.
And how crucial do you think is the role played by President Trump? Because he does seem to have somehow managed to steamroller both sides to at least getting to this point.
Yeah, I mean, he's moved from a somewhat, well-meaning but rather fantastical idea about sort of Las Vegas on the Mediterranean as the answer to something that's for real. Low-key governance, Palestinians who are qualified with international experts at their side, an international and Arab stabilization force. These are realistic, difficult but realistic ideas. And I think with, the coin of the realm ever since, frankly, Jimmy Carter's involvement in peace brokering in the Middle East so many years ago, the coin of the realm is presidential involvement. And President Trump is clearly committed and engaged to this. He believes in it. And that is going to give this whole effort a great deal of force.
David Hale, former US Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Great to speak to you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.